Anything can happen during a film shoot, even the director getting fired right in the middle of production. In this video, I'll tell you about the most dramatic and interesting cases where directors were replaced during filming, why it happened, and how it affected the movies. This is a little longer. My name is Max. Let's go. 20th Century Fox temporarily halted production on the Queen biopic Bohemian Rhapsody because director Bryan Singer was absent from the set. This news broke on December 2, 2017. Sources said Singer didn't return to London after the Thanksgiving break. Just 2 days later, on December 4th, the studio announced, Bryan Singer is no longer the director of this film. At first, that might seem like a harsh move for just being a couple of days late. But that was only part of the reason he was fired. First of all, Bryan Singer already had a reputation for disappearing from set for several days. It had happened before on Superman Returns and X-Men Apocalypse. Rumor has it these absences were linked to some unhealthy and possibly illegal habits. Second, both the producers and lead actor Rami Malek were fed up with Singer constantly showing up late. Every time, the cinematographer had to step in and direct instead. Malek had already complained about Singer being unreliable, and the two often clashed on set. So this time, his disappearance was the last straw. But in the end, a different reason for the firing came to light. Bohemian Rhapsody producer Graham King explained that, just 16 or 17 days before the shoot was supposed to wrap, Singer's mother became seriously ill. He needed to be with her, and understandably couldn't focus on the film. The studio, however, wanted to keep going. So Singer was removed, and Dexter Fletcher was brought in to finish the film. However, Bryan Singer is still credited as the director. According to insiders, Fletcher shot about 15% of the movie, but under Directors Guild rules, that's not enough to get the official credit. So in the final version of Bohemian Rhapsody, it's Singer's name that appears, even though by the time the film premiered, it barely felt like his anymore. Bryan Singer is a controversial figure in modern Hollywood. Besides his constant delays and behind-the-scenes issues, he has also been linked to multiple sexual misconduct allegations. As of now, Bohemian Rhapsody remains the last film in the troubled director's career. Dexter Fletcher, on the other hand, who stepped in to finish the Queen biopic, went on to direct another hit musical biography, Rocketman, the story of Elton John. 13 Oscar nominations, 8 wins, and a cast led by Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable, Gone with the Wind is an adaptation of Margaret Mitchell's sweeping novel and one of the most iconic films in cinema history. Since the author refused to adapt her book into a screenplay, the script was handled by a team of 17 writers. Even Alfred Hitchcock and F. Scott Fitzgerald were brought in as consultants. The director chosen for the project was George Cukor. By the time Gone with the Wind began production, Cukor had already directed Little Women with Katharine Hepburn, Camille with Greta Garbo, and Holiday with Hepburn and Cary Grant. He had a strong reputation as a women's director, someone who brought out the best in female characters and worked well with actresses. That was one of the main reasons he was hired for this film. Cukor prepped the movie and began filming, but even after production was already in full swing, and he was fired. Producer David O. Selznick believed Cukor struggled with staging large-scale battle scenes. But there was another reason, maybe even the main one, and that reason was Clark Gable. Clark Gable, already a major star at the time, didn't feel comfortable working under Cukor, who was openly gay. Gable felt the director focused too much on the female characters, and not enough on his own role as Rhett Butler. There were also rumors that Cukor knew something unpleasant about Gable's past, from a time when Gable allegedly worked as a male escort, and that only added to the tension between them. George Cukor was fired, and Victor Fleming, who had previously worked with Gable, was brought in to replace him. Still, Cukor's influence on the film didn't disappear. He was the one who developed the visual style of many key scenes and helped Vivien Leigh and Olivia de Havilland understand their characters more deeply. According to the actresses, they continued to secretly meet with Cukor even after he left the project, to go over their performances in private. Some of the scenes Cukor shot remained in the final cut, especially those with a more intimate, character-driven feel. Fleming, unlike Cukor, was a master of large-scale action and epic moments, but struggled with emotional scenes centered on women. In a way, their very different directing styles ended up complementing each other. But even Victor Fleming didn't make it to the end of filming without trouble. He had a nervous breakdown, and on April 29th, he threw the script down in front of Vivien Leigh and walked off the set. Sam Wood was urgently brought in to replace him, probably the least famous of the three directors, but still a solid professional. After a couple of weeks, Fleming recovered and returned to work, with Sam Wood staying on as second-unit director. These behind-the-scenes conflicts and director swaps didn't stop the film from becoming a masterpiece. In fact, they may not have just not hurt it, they might be part of what made it great. The last few years haven't been the brightest for the Star Wars universe, but today we're focusing on one film in particular, Solo, a Star Wars story. When most of the movie was already shot, the studio suddenly fired the directing duo Phil Lord and Christopher Miller and brought in the more experienced Ron Howard to finish the job. And yet, everything started out with the intention of hiring Lord and Miller precisely to bring a bit of meta humor and quirky charm to the story. Their previous projects, 21 Jump Street, 22 Jump Street, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and the Lego Movie, were all known for their comedy and creative tone. Sure, choosing them was risky, but it was also a bold and potentially refreshing move. And honestly, it's hard to imagine how they could have done serious damage to a franchise that was already struggling with the quality of its recent films. On top of that, the story of Han Solo, one of the funniest and most charismatic characters in the Star Wars universe, seemed like a perfect match for Lord and Miller's style. However, it quickly became clear that what works in a quirky action comedy doesn't always fit within the strict canon of the Star Wars universe. According to insiders, Lord and Miller encouraged a lot of improvisation from the actors, something that clashed with the vision of producer Kathleen Kennedy and screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan, a franchise veteran who wrote The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Kasdan insisted on sticking closely to the script, while the directing duo kept drifting further away from it, take after take, coming up with dialogue on the fly. Some even said it started to feel like a comedy improv, with Alden Ehrenreich's Han Solo beginning to resemble a parody of the character instead of the real deal. That didn't sit well with Kennedy and Kasdan, who had hoped for a more serious tone. Lord and Miller were fired, and Ron Howard reshot nearly 80% of the film. As a result, the original directors were credited only as executive producers. The final product? A technically polished but soulless blockbuster, stitched together from different visions and lacking any real spark. It's hard not to blame the directorial switch for that. Moneyball isn't just a film that earned 6 Academy Award nominations, but went home empty-handed. It's a movie that actually changed the game. Moneyball has since become a household term, now used to describe any sports team that relies on data-driven decisions rather than gut feeling and old-school traditions. At first, the project was entrusted to Steven Soderbergh, one of Hollywood's most respected directors, known for straddling the line between mainstream hits and experimental cinema. He seemed like the perfect fit to adapt a book about revolutionizing baseball through analytics. But as it turned out, Soderbergh's vision leaned far too experimental for the studio's liking. He planned to insert real interviews with actual baseball players into the narrative, blending documentary elements with fiction. Even more out there, the film's narrator was supposed to be an animated character. Sony wasn't having it. With a $60 million budget on the line, the idea of funding something that felt half documentary, half feature film seemed like too big a gamble. Everything was already set, and technically there was just 1 week left before filming started, so they had to make a decision. And they decided to remove Soderbergh. Bennett Miller was brought in as the new director. At that time, his filmography wasn't as rich as Soderbergh's. He had only directed one feature, the biographical film Capote starring Philip Seymour Hoffman. Not the most obvious choice, but Miller was supported by Brad Pitt himself, who really wanted to make this film. In the end, the final version of the script, and the whole story, became the result of the work of several people: director Bennett Miller, producer and lead actor Brad Pitt, and Aaron Sorkin, who wrote the final draft of the screenplay. The film turned out great. It even had a real impact on sports, After its release, many teams around the world started using data analytics more actively to build their rosters and strategies. Now I'm going to tell you about a true classic of cinema, a film directed by George Cukor and Victor Fleming. Yes, you heard that right. Those same names. But the story didn't start with them. It started with Richard Thorpe, who was the first director of The Wizard of Oz. Another iconic film that left a mark on cinema, and one that had a very troubled production. The Tin Man had to be hospitalized with severe poisoning, Dorothy was harassed and even hit, and the Wicked Witch suffered burns. That's just a brief glimpse of what was happening behind the scenes of the movie. Richard Thorpe, the studio's first choice to direct, was known as a highly efficient craftsman. He worked fast, kept things simple, and always stayed on schedule. Over the years, he directed dozens of films, but almost none of them made a big splash. The studio valued him not for his originality, but for being reliable, and that's why he was brought in to work on The Wizard of Oz. Filming began in October 1938, and Thorpe jumped in at his usual pace. But he only lasted 2 weeks. The producers didn't like the tone he was setting. The movie lacked a magical feeling and looked dull and flat on screen. Thorpe rushed the actors to stay on schedule, which hurt their performances. Judy Garland, who played the lead, didn't come across as a sweet, innocent girl from Kansas. Because of the light wig and heavy makeup Thorpe insisted on, she looked much older than she should have. Thorpe was supposed to be replaced by our old friend George Cukor, but he only joined the project for a couple of weeks before heading off to shoot Gone with the Wind. He wasn't really the director, more of a creative advisor. Still, his contribution was key. He helped shape the visual style we now associate with the film. Cukor took off Judy Garland's awkward wig, got rid of the doll-like makeup, and simply told her to be herself. The magic of the story started to return. When Cukor left to direct Gone with the Wind, he was replaced by Victor Fleming, someone we already know. Fleming is considered the main director of this great, though troubled film. But even he didn't stay till the end, because as you might guess, he went on to replace Cukor on Gone with the Wind. To finish the movie, and by that point there wasn't much left to do, the studio brought in King Vidor, who was then serving as the first president of the Directors Guild of America. Vidor was asked to complete the scenes that hadn't yet been shot, and it's those moments, seemingly simple and low-key, that ended up giving the film its warmth and sincerity, a contrast to the spectacle of Oz. Later, Vidor said he was especially moved by working with Judy Garland and that he never sought official credit. He just wanted to help finish a beautiful film. King Vidor doesn't appear in the final credits, and that was a conscious decision by both him and the studio. The producers didn't want to add more names to what was already a long list of directors. Besides, most of the movie had been shot by Victor Fleming. Vidor was more like a silent helper, a kind of directing stand-in. This is the story of how a director change led to the creation of 2 different movies, the original Justice League and Zack Snyder's Justice League, also known as the Snyder Cut. It all started after Man of Steel came out in 2013. Snyder was given free rein to build the entire DC cinematic universe. But when Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice received mixed reviews and average scores, the studio decided the next film needed to be less dark and more upbeat. Filming for Justice League began in April 2016. According to many crew members, the atmosphere on set was tense. Snyder was under pressure from the studio, the script kept changing, and the studio assigned 2 producers to oversee the shoot and push for a lighter tone. In May 2017, Zack Snyder officially left the project. The reason was a personal tragedy, the death of his daughter. But later it came out that by the time Snyder left, he was already in conflict with Warner Brothers and the studio had been pushing him to step away. After the tragedy with his daughter, Snyder no longer had the strength to keep fighting for the film. As he admitted, he simply didn't have the emotional or mental energy to go up against the system. After his departure, control of the film was handed over to Joss Whedon, who had spent years working with Marvel. It would be nice to say things went smoothly from there, but that wasn't the case. Not only was Snyder's version of the film completely reworked, but new problems started to surface. Justice League went through major reshoots, and one of the oddest issues involved Henry Cavill's mustache. He had grown it for Mission Impossible Fallout, and his contract didn't allow him to shave it, so the mustache had to be digitally removed for the role of Superman. After reshoots and post-production, the film did become lighter and less dark, just like the studio wanted, but it lost its coherence. Some characters and storylines were cut. In the end, the film's performance was close to a failure. The budget was $300 million, not including marketing, but it made just over $650 million at the box office. But the issue wasn't just money. Critics and audiences felt the movie was messy, with weak visual effects and little emotional weight. Online, the hashtag #ReleaseTheSnyderCut went viral. Fans started petitions demanding to see Zack Snyder's version of the film. The cast also voiced their support. A rough cut of Justice League was saved on Snyder's hard drive, but he didn't want to simply release it as is. Instead, he struck a deal with Warner Brothers. They would give him a budget for visual effects and he would finish the film without taking a fee. Snyder doubled the runtime, changed the aspect ratio to nearly square, and restored the cut's storylines. He also created a black and white version. The whole thing cost about $70 million. The film, now known as the Snyder Cut, was received much more warmly than Joss Whedon's Justice League. But Snyder and the DC Universe still went their separate ways. He moved on to new projects, while James Gunn was brought in to lead the franchise forward. A similar re-editing story happened with Richard Donner, and he actually did it even before Snyder, and also with a DC superhero movie. Back in 1977, the studio decided to make a Superman film starring Christopher Reeve. They were so confident it would be a success that they started filming two movies at once, the first Superman and its sequel at the same time. Both were directed by Richard Donner, who had recently made the horror hit The Omen. While it may seem like the first Superman film went smoothly, tension between Donner and the studio was already brewing. Donner wanted to do things right, while the studio wanted things fast and cheap. After the first film was released and made a lot of money, and with Superman 2 about 75% complete, the studio decided to fire Donner. Rumors had been circulating for a while, and Richard Lester, who replaced him, was already working on set as a second-unit director. Donner's version was more epic in tone, while Lester aimed for something lighter and, in his words, more playful. A lot was reshot, nearly everything was re-edited, and Marlon Brando's character was cut entirely. The studio would have had to pay Brando nearly 12% of the film's box office under his contract, which would have been a huge sum. For decades, fans believed that Donner's original cut still existed. They collected material, compared early scripts, and studied interviews with the cast and crew. Eventually, they got what they hoped for. Donner made a deal with Warner Brothers to reassemble his version. To do so, they used deleted scenes from Superman 2, footage from the theatrical cut, and even some screen test material. Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut was released on DVD and Blu-ray in 2006 alongside Superman Returns. In 2004, German director Oliver Hirschbiegel made a name for himself with the intense chamber drama Downfall, and then headed to Hollywood for his first major studio project. But the leap didn't go as planned. The project was The Invasion, a sci-fi thriller based on Jack Finney's novel The Body Snatchers. This was already the fourth cinematic adaptation of the story. The film starred Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig. Hirschbiegel envisioned a slow burn, psychological thriller in the vein of European auteur cinema. But the studio wanted something else entirely, a fast-paced, action-heavy Hollywood blockbuster. After principal photography wrapped in 2006, Warner Bros. Executives were unhappy with the result. They felt the film was too slow and lacked tension. Instead of asking Hirschbiegel to rework the film, the studio sidelined him. They brought in the Wachowskis to revise the script, and director James McTeigue, known for V for Vendetta, to oversee extensive reshoots. They spent $10 million on reshoots, and the film was completed. Officially, Oliver Hirschbiegel remained the director, while James McTeigue, who led the reshoots, wasn't credited at all. As a result, the movie ended up feeling torn in two. The first half, tense, atmospheric, focused on paranoia and isolation, kept Hirschbiegel's style. But the second half turned into a typical Hollywood action movie with chases and explosions, ending with a scene added at the last minute just to make the audience leave feeling satisfied. After this experience, Hirschbiegel returned to Europe to have more creative freedom, and the invasion was both a critical and box office failure. You might want to say the studio should have given the director more freedom and things would have turned out better. But in truth, the mistake was made from the start. Hirschbiegel just wasn't the right choice for the kind of action movie the producers wanted. In 1987, director Steve Rash made a high school romantic comedy starring a very young Patrick Dempsey called Can't Buy Me Love. The film turned out well, and Rash was trusted with another comedy project, one that would go on to launch an entire franchise. He started working on a movie about a dog named Beethoven. The script about a huge St. Bernard and the Newton family was written by none other than John Hughes, the master of teen stories. The cast included Charles Grodin, Bonnie Hunt, Stanley Tucci, David Duchovny, and other recognizable actors. It was supposed to be a classic family movie full of wild situations, but from the very beginning, there were creative differences between Rash and the producers. According to witnesses, Rash wanted to make a more grounded film, with a softer, almost dramatic tone, focused on human emotions. The producers wanted something fast-paced and funny with broad, easy-to-understand humor. Basically, a regular family comedy. It started to feel like the director and the producers were making two completely different movies. On top of that, Rash wasn't too excited about building a comedy around an animal. His approach to working with the dog raised concerns. He didn't use the trainers as much as needed or didn't want to, and he struggled to adapt scenes to the dog's presence. Not exactly the ideal way to approach a movie about a dog. At some point, the tension became too much, and after a few weeks of filming, Rash was fired. He was replaced by Bryan, who quickly reorganized the process and, most importantly, built a good working relationship with the dog named Chris, who played Beethoven. When Levant was brought in to replace Rash, he had mostly worked in television and had just finished his first feature film, Problem Child 2. He didn't have a ton of experience, but Beethoven turned out to be a success. Audiences loved it. It spawned a bunch of sequels, most of which were unnecessary, and it made around $150 million at the box office. Bryan didn't direct the sequel to Beethoven, but he went on to make other decent films like Jingle All the Way with Arnold Schwarzenegger. As for Steve Rash, after getting fired from Beethoven, he never really bounced back. He mostly directed odd and unnecessary sequels like American Pie Presents, Bandcamp. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, we'll definitely make a follow-up. And don't forget to share your ideas. Which director and film do you think we should talk about next? Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and see you next time.